I'm the reason a luxury neighborhood got quarantined. At least that's what people said on the evening news. The truth is, I never poisoned a single drop of water, I never dumped chemicals into that lake, and I never broke the law. I just stopped saving something that everyone else assumed would take care of itself. My name is Cole Bennett. I'm 39 years old, licensed in aquatic pest control and lake management, and for almost a decade, I kept one of the prettiest private communities outside Winter Haven, Florida, looking like it belonged on the cover of a real estate magazine. Folks drove through those gates and saw crystal clear water, white egrets standing in the reeds, fountains sparkling under the afternoon sun, kids feeding colorful fish from little wooden docks. What they didn't see was me showing up before sunrise every Monday in an old white service truck covered in mud and mosquito spray residue. Paradise always has somebody behind the curtain, and in Hawthorne Shores, that somebody was me. I wasn't one of the wealthy homeowners with matching golf carts and six-figure boats tied behind lakefront mansions. I lived 5 minutes away in a modest ranch house my dad left me, with an aging workshop, a vegetable garden my late mother planted years ago, and a truck that had seen more back roads than paved ones. My customers respected my work, or at least most of them did. They'd wave while walking their dogs, ask how the fish were doing, complain about mosquitoes after heavy rain, and I'd smile because I already knew the answer before they asked. A healthy lake isn't luck. It's chemistry, biology, timing, and a whole lot of boring maintenance nobody wants to think about until something goes wrong. That's probably why I ignored the little signs that things were changing. A new HOA board had taken over after a neighborhood election that somehow became more competitive than a city council race. Their new president was a woman named Veronica Hale, recently retired after running a chain of luxury wellness spas. She had money, confidence, and that polished smile people wear when they're about to tell you how much smarter they think they are. During our first meeting, she looked at my truck through the clubhouse window and asked, "Does it always have to look so industrial?" I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Over the next few months, she talked constantly about building a healthier community, organic landscaping, natural mosquito control, chemical-free living, social media posts about sustainability. Professional photographers wandered around taking pictures of residents doing yoga beside the lake, while I quietly unloaded equipment before dawn so I wouldn't ruin the aesthetic. At first, it was almost funny. Every time Veronica made a speech about living in harmony with nature, I'd be standing 50 yards away carrying tanks full of the products that actually kept nature from taking over the neighborhood. My invoices started getting paid later and later. 30 days became 45. 45 became 60. Every time I called the management office, I'd hear the same answer. Accounting is reviewing everything. I'd worked long enough to know cash flow problems when I saw them, but Hawthorne Shores wasn't broke. People there spent more on outdoor kitchens than I made in a year. They weren't short on money. They just didn't think paying contractors was urgent. Then one Friday morning, I pulled through the front gate before sunrise and found a laminated notice tucked under my windshield wiper. It wasn't from security. It wasn't from management. It was signed personally by Veronica Hale. Effective immediately, commercial chemical application vehicles were prohibited inside the community except with prior written approval from the HOA board. Violations would result in a $500 fine and possible removal from vendor access. I actually looked around to see if someone was filming a prank video. My truck wasn't visiting the neighborhood. My truck was literally the reason their lake stayed alive. I walked straight into the clubhouse carrying the notice. Veronica was arranging flowers in the lobby with 2 board members sipping imported coffee. She looked up without the slightest bit of concern. "Morning, Cole." I held up the paper. "You planning to treat mosquitoes with positive thoughts now?" One of the board members snorted, trying not to laugh, but Veronica folded her arms. "We want cleaner optics for the community. Residents don't appreciate seeing hazardous vehicles every week." "Hazardous?" I asked. "You've watched me service this lake for 9 years." She smiled that practice smile again. "Perception matters." I nodded slowly, then reached into my folder and placed 3 unpaid invoices on the reception desk. "Reality matters too. You're 63 days behind." She barely glanced at them. "Accounting will process those when they can. According to our contract, you're already in default." "Then have your attorney call ours," she said before turning back to her flowers as if we were discussing landscaping instead of a legal agreement. I stood there another second waiting for someone to be reasonable. Nobody did. Walking back to my truck, I kept hearing my father's voice from years ago. He owned a small plumbing business, and whenever customers acted like skilled tradesmen were disposable, he'd tell me, "Son, people never notice the man keeping the water flowing until they're standing ankle-deep in their own mess." That weekend, I pulled every document related to Hawthorne Shores out of my office cabinet. Contracts, amendments, inspection reports, payment history, emails going back almost a decade. Then I found Clause 17, the paragraph I hadn't needed once in 9 years. Services may be suspended immediately upon unresolved payment default. Contractor-owned equipment shall remain under exclusive operational control of the contractor. I read it 3 times. Monday morning, I drove to the lake before sunrise one last time, unlocked the equipment enclosure, shut down the aeration system, disconnected my monitoring units, documented every step with time-stamped photos, emailed the HOA explaining exactly why services were being suspended, and quietly drove away while the fountain behind me continued spraying into the sunrise, looking perfectly normal. Because some disasters don't announce themselves on the first day. Some of them wait until everyone has forgotten the warning. The first couple of days were almost peaceful, which honestly made me question whether I'd overestimated my own importance. I drove past Hawthorne Shores on another service call across town, and the lake still looked beautiful from the entrance. The fountain was running, sunlight danced across the surface, and a pair of retirees were paddling matching kayaks like nothing had changed. I remember laughing to myself and thinking maybe Veronica would get away with it after all. Nature has a funny way of giving people confidence right before it humbles them. By the 4th day, my phone started buzzing. Not from the HOA, but from residents I'd known for years. Mrs. Delgado called first. "Cole, have you noticed the water looking greener?" I told her as politely as I could that I was no longer under contract to monitor the lake and suggested she contact the HOA board. She sounded confused more than angry. "I thought you were still taking care of everything." "I was," I answered, "until your board decided they didn't need me anymore." There was a long silence before she quietly said, "Nobody told us that." That sentence stayed with me. Nobody told the homeowners. The board had quietly suspended the one service keeping the ecosystem balanced and somehow expected no one to notice. By the end of the week, people definitely noticed. Florida heat doesn't forgive neglect. Without continuous aeration, oxygen levels began dropping. Without routine larvicide treatments, mosquito larvae multiplied faster than anyone who hadn't studied aquatic biology could imagine. Without algae management, microscopic blooms spread beneath the surface until the lake looked like someone had poured green paint into it overnight. The fountain kept shooting water into the air, creating the illusion that everything underneath was healthy, but I knew exactly what was happening below that surface. Fish began gathering near the edges, searching for oxygen. Turtles disappeared. The birds stopped landing. Then came the smell. It wasn't dramatic at first. Just that heavy swamp odor anyone who grew up in Florida recognizes immediately. Sweet, rotten, humid, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes after 10 minutes outside. Veronica responded exactly the way I expected. She posted on the community website that seasonal algae fluctuations were completely normal and assured residents that the board was consulting environmental experts. I almost spit out my coffee when I read that because nobody had called me, nobody had hired another contractor, and there wasn't enough wishful thinking in the world to replace years of professional maintenance. 3 days later, my voicemail filled with messages. "Cole, can you just come look? We have mosquitoes everywhere. The kids can't even play outside." One father sent me a video from his backyard. You could actually hear the mosquitoes before you saw them, a constant high-pitched buzzing surrounding the patio furniture while his little girl slapped at her arms every few seconds. I felt bad for them. I really did. They weren't the ones who stopped paying invoices or decided optics mattered more than science. But sympathy doesn't change contracts, and it certainly doesn't erase liability. I archived every voicemail without responding. Then something happened that shifted the entire story from neighborhood drama to county business. A local pediatrician reported multiple suspected mosquito-borne illnesses within the same gated community. Public health investigators don't ignore patterns like that. 2 county trucks rolled into Hawthorne Shores on a humid Tuesday morning. Water samples were collected. Mosquito traps were set. Inspectors walked the shoreline taking photographs while residents watched from expensive patios with worried expressions replacing their usual confidence. That afternoon, Veronica finally called me. I let it ring twice before answering. "Cole," she said, her voice noticeably softer than before. "We'd like you to resume maintenance immediately. I'd like my invoices paid immediately. Can we discuss that later?" "No," she sighed. "This isn't the time for pride." I leaned back in my chair. "You're right. This is the time for contracts." She tried another approach. "People are getting upset. People should ask why they were never told maintenance had been suspended." Silence. Then she whispered, "You're enjoying this." I looked out my office window at another lake I maintained, perfectly clear, dragonflies hovering above the cattails. "No, Veronica. If I were enjoying this, I wouldn't have spent 9 years preventing it." She hung up without another word. The county report arrived 2 days later, and it was worse than I expected. Elevated mosquito breeding activity, rapid algae bloom, declining dissolved oxygen, dead fish beginning to accumulate near the eastern shoreline. Corrective action required immediately. The report also included a timeline, one that matched almost perfectly with the date my services officially stopped. Residents demanded an emergency HOA meeting. For the first time since this whole mess began, homeowners started asking uncomfortable questions instead of accepting polished speeches. One older gentleman apparently stood up during the meeting and asked Veronica a simple question. "Did we fire the lake contractor?" She answered, "No." Then another resident asked, "Did we stop paying him?" According to someone who later called me, Veronica never answered that one. She moved on to another agenda item. That's when people started requesting financial records. Funny how transparency suddenly becomes popular when property values are involved. Real estate agents began warning prospective buyers about environmental concerns. 2 pending home sales collapsed within 48 hours. Photos of the green lake started circulating on neighborhood Facebook groups. Local news stations picked up the story after county health officials issued precautionary guidance recommending residents avoid prolonged exposure around stagnant water until further testing could be completed. I watched the evening broadcast sitting alone in my living room. They blurred the community entrance, but anyone nearby knew exactly where it was. The reporter called it an unexpected environmental failure. Unexpected. I laughed louder than I should have. There had been nothing unexpected about any of it. Every stage had been predictable months in advance. Biology doesn't negotiate. Chemistry doesn't care about HOA politics. Nature simply follows its own rules. 3 days later, there was a knock on my front door just after sunset. I opened it and barely recognized Veronica. Gone was the perfect hair, designer sunglasses, and effortless confidence. Her eyes were exhausted. Red mosquito bites covered both arms. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in a week. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked past me toward the shelves in my office where binders containing nearly a decade of maintenance records sat neatly labeled. "Can we fix this?" she asked quietly. I studied her face, searching for the woman who had smiled while dismissing every invoice I'd placed on her desk. She was gone. Standing there instead was someone who had finally discovered that reality doesn't care how expensive your neighborhood is. I stepped aside and motioned toward the conference table inside. "Come on in," I said. "Let's talk about what fixing it actually costs." Veronica sat across from me without saying much while I opened one binder after another. Every inspection report, every invoice, every email reminder, every photograph of the lake going back years was organized by date. My father used to tell me that paperwork isn't exciting until the day it saves your life, and sitting there across from the HOA president, I realized he'd been right again. I slid a folder across the table. "This is what it'll take to stabilize the lake before it becomes a long-term ecological disaster." She opened it with shaky hands. Emergency aeration equipment, algae remediation, mosquito control, water quality restoration, fish restocking, environmental testing, legal compliance inspections, expedited labor. The total sat just north of $160,000. Behind that estimate was another page listing unpaid invoices, late penalties authorized under the contract, and a new multi-year maintenance agreement that required advance payment before I would move a single piece of equipment back onto the property. Veronica stared at the numbers for a long time before looking up. "We don't have this kind of money." I nodded. "You did. Before the board decided paying contractors wasn't important." She rubbed her forehead. "The county froze most of our reserve account this morning." That didn't surprise me. Public health investigations tend to move quickly once there's evidence that a preventable hazard has been ignored. The following week, the county held a formal hearing. I wasn't there as the accused. I was there because I had been subpoenaed to provide documentation. The attorneys asked straightforward questions, and I gave straightforward answers. Yes, I had maintained the lake for years. Yes, the HOA had stopped paying according to the contract. Yes, I had notified them in writing before suspending service. Yes, the contract specifically allowed that suspension. The county attorney asked one question that seemed to settle the entire room. "Mr. Bennett, did you damage the lake after suspending your services?" "No, sir," I answered. "I simply stopped preventing predictable biological processes." There wasn't much left to argue after that. Independent environmental experts confirmed everything I documented. The lake hadn't been poisoned. It had been neglected. The difference mattered, legally and scientifically. Over the next month, the consequences piled up faster than anyone expected. The HOA received substantial civil penalties for failing to address a documented environmental risk after repeated warnings. Insurance carriers declined to cover much of the damage because maintenance obligations had been ignored. Several homeowners filed lawsuits against the association for withholding information about the service suspension while continuing to collect HOA dues. Board meetings turned into shouting matches. Neighbors who had barely spoken before suddenly demanded financial records, email correspondence, and voting minutes. Veronica resigned before the investigations were even finished. I heard later that she spent months dealing with civil claims and eventually filed for personal bankruptcy after separate legal expenses overwhelmed her finances. I didn't celebrate any of that. Contrary to what people imagine, watching someone lose everything isn't nearly as satisfying as movie endings make it seem. Mostly it felt sad. Pride has a way of convincing otherwise intelligent people that admitting a mistake is more expensive than fixing one. Usually the opposite is true. Eventually, the homeowners elected an entirely new board. Their first official action was calling my office. Not to negotiate. Not to argue. To apologize. The new president, an older retired engineer named Harold, shook my hand and said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "We confused invisible work with unnecessary work." That sentence meant more than any check they ever wrote. We signed a new long-term maintenance agreement with stricter payment protections for both sides, complete financial transparency, and clear emergency procedures so no future board could quietly suspend critical services without notifying every homeowner. Restoring the lake wasn't quick. Healthy ecosystems don't recover overnight just because someone writes a check. It took months of careful monitoring before the water turned clear again, before the mosquitoes dropped back to normal levels, before young fish returned to the shoreline and families felt comfortable sitting on their docks after sunset. The first evening I watched children tossing fish food from one of those wooden piers again, I finally felt like the whole ordeal was behind us. A few months later, one of the lakefront homes entered foreclosure after its owner decided to move away during all the legal turmoil. I wasn't looking for revenge or a trophy, but the price was far below market value, and after years of building other people's paradise, I figured maybe it was time to enjoy a little of it myself. I bought the house, parked my same old white service truck in the driveway, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The truck that had once been called an eyesore was now sitting beside one of the nicest views in the entire neighborhood. Every now and then a new resident asks if I ever get tired of looking at the lake. I usually smile and tell them the truth. Not really. I know exactly what it takes to keep it looking like that. Maybe some people still think I should have stepped in sooner, ignored the contract, and fixed everything for free. Maybe others believe the HOA got exactly what it deserved. I still think about that sometimes, because the line between responsibility and enabling bad behavior isn't always as clear as people pretend. I never wanted anyone to get sick. I never wanted families to worry about their children or watch their neighborhood become the evening news. But I also know this. When people treat skilled professionals like they're disposable, they often discover far too late just how valuable invisible work really is. So now I want to hear from you. If you had been in my position, would you have restarted the maintenance without payment, or would you have stood your ground and let the contract speak for itself? Do you think the HOA board got what it deserved, or should I have handled it differently? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this rarely have simple answers. And if you enjoy real-world conflicts where pride, responsibility, and accountability collide. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.